Brendan Williams is the Vice President of Public Relations of PBF Energy. Brendan, good to have you here on the John Fredericks Radio Network. Thanks for being with us, sir.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, whenever Ted Cruz goes to the White House, you know, we're always a little antennas up, wondering what's going on. Tell us about the renewable fuel standards, what Cruz is trying to do, what the president wants to do. We know the president made some promises to Iowans when he was campaigning there when I was with him in Iowa. Can you lay this whole thing out for us, sir?
Sure. So the crux of the issue is the renewable fuel standard mandates that a certain amount, certain physical quantity of biofuel, ethanol, biodiesel, a couple other types of biofuel, are blended into the fuel supply each year. And then there's a couple of issues with the way the standard is set up. Well, first of all, it was actually the law was passed at a time when we were talking about peak oil and reliance on foreign oil. It was before the shale boom, but it was a different energy landscape. And it's also when we thought gasoline demand would be a lot higher than it is. So fast forward about a decade, and what's happened is the law actually requires more biofuel to be blended into the fuel supply than all engines and infrastructure can handle. And what makes it really challenging and really costly for consumers and actually refiners is the credit system they set up to implement the standard. It's kind of like a cap-and-trade program. So refiners actually have to get credits to show a certain amount of biofuel has been blended into the fuel supply, blended into gasoline. The problem is not all refiners have like big marketing businesses that do the blending and actually deliver the fuel to consumers. And so what happens is you've got a mandate that requires more ethanol than the fuel supply can handle, and you have this credit system that makes refiners responsible for complying even if they don't have the ability to comply. And so this is, as you can imagine, creates a lot of winners and losers. You have some, really big integrated companies that they make your gasoline, they also blend it and sell it at retail. They get more credits than they need. And you have a lot of independent refiners, like all the ones up and down the East Coast, that they just make your gasoline. They just refine. They don't blend ethanol or anything into it. But they have to buy all these credits from often their competitors who actually do more blending than they do refining. So because the law requires more biofuel than the fuel supply can handle, that creates some scarcity right there and makes the credits really expensive. And then you have a system that picks winners and losers that lets certain parties drive the price up even more. And so it's really actually come to a point where it's threatening refining jobs, particularly on the East Coast. In Philadelphia, we saw the largest refinery on the East Coast, which is what we call a merchant refiner. It's one of the ones I was talking about that doesn't do any blending. They spent more on these credits last year than they did for payroll. They had to lay off 100 people. They had to cut benefits. And if the cost of these credits, doesn't change, you could see that spread. And to give you an example of how much they cost, before 2013, they cost 3 to 6 cents a gallon. They were pretty much just a transactional cost. Now they're approaching $1 a gallon. And this credit market, these credits are called RINs. It's a $17 billion market right now. And that's, independent refiners that, have to buy them from often their competitors are paying for it, and so are consumers. And so at the White House, what you have today is you have 9 senators that sent a letter to the president, and they said, look, we understand you support ethanol, and we're not anti-ethanol, but something's got to happen with this crazy system so that, we're not threatening refining jobs, the same manufacturing jobs that the president promised to protect. And so I think the hope is that they can have a conversation with the president and find a way to, the art of the deal, right? See if you can find a deal where, the president keeps his commitment to Iowa, but also, helps mitigate some of this cost that's threatening jobs in places like Pennsylvania.
All right, so basically, Brendan, what you're trying to do here is this whole credit thing, it sounds scammy to me. It sounds swampy, right?
It is. Because, it's swampy.
It's very swampy. And so it came out of the swamp, and it's got these credits, and it's costing us manufactures good jobs in other parts of the country. So it's a scam, swamp, Chuck Grassley thing. So is there specific legislation that you want the senators to get behind, for the president to get behind? I mean, just give us some specifics on what we can do in order to move the needle here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things really. One, EPA actually has a lot of discretion for the program, and there's a lot of things that EPA could do. We recommended just lowering the volume to a level that's reasonable, that doesn't create such a tight market. EPA decided not to do that. Now they can still, turn back that decision, so that's one thing they can do. But they also have a lot of discretion with this credit program. So there's lots of different ways EPA can at least create some kind of safety valves to mitigate the cost of these credits. That's number one. I think over the longer term, that's one of the things we're hoping that, can be done in the near term, because we don't want what's happening in Philadelphia to start spreading, not only up and down the East Coast, but across the country. But two, over the longer term, we really need Congress to actually reform the renewable fuel standard. We think that at some point in time, the requirement, the volume that you're going to require to be put in the fuel supply has to actually be achievable.
Right.
And this credit system has to be fixed permanently. So in the near term, EPA has a lot of discretion to either create some kind of safety valve or moderate the volumes to bring down costs. Over the long term, Congress is actually going to have to get together and find a way to address this issue legislatively. Because as I mentioned, when the law was passed, we were facing a different energy landscape. And it's a really complex law. We have to update it to reflect reality. Last Congress, oddly enough, you kind of had this weird right-left combo where you had a guy like Peter Welsh team up with a guy like Bill Flores and said, hey, let's just make the requirement what all engines and infrastructure can handle, and let's set a reasonable volume so it doesn't drive up the cost of this thing. That's at least a good first step. And again, you've had someone on the right end of the spectrum and the left end of the spectrum saying this. You also have environmental groups that don't think biofuels are as friendly for the environment as they were labeled, which is why you get this kind of left-right combo on this issue.
Right. So basically,
there's a lot of potential solutions. The near-term EPA should look at either creating a safety valve or mitigating the volumes in some way, shape, or form. But Congress is going to have to get together and fix this thing for the long term.
We are with Brendan Williams, Vice President at PBF Energy, and we're concerned about the renewable fuel standards, ethanol. We understand the president did make a promise to Iowans during the Iowa caucuses that he wants to fulfill, but we're trying to find a way to do that without the swamp getting involved. We have a caller who has some knowledge on this and would like to engage with Brendan Williams and ask a question. Den in Chesapeake, a former engineer, and Den Black is the guy that actually designs cars and engines, and he designed the original Saturn, which I still have, by the way. I have my 2008 Saturn Astra. That's right. It's got 152,000 miles on it and still runs like a top. Den, good to have you. What's your question, sir?
Okay, John. Just a comment from the engineering point of view, the chemistry point of view that your caller might want to comment on if he's aware, and of course Congress dearly needs to be aware of this, that what should be done is to abandon the use of America's corn stock to create ethanol in the first place. And the reason for that is that the energy balance necessary to create a gallon of ethanol fuel is almost 1-to-1. It takes almost as much energy to make a gallon of ethanol fuel as it can produce in the fuel tank. Now, the reason that Brazil is so much into ethanol is they use sugarcane as the feedstock. And if you look at that, the energy balance there says you get about 6 times more energy out than you put in to make the ethanol, okay? But with corn, you just eat up the corn, and it can't be used for other uses, and you essentially don't get anything. Now, luckily, our council here in Chesapeake had an opportunity to put an ethanol plant in at South Norfolk here 3 or 4 years ago, and they were wise enough to tell them to go put the plant somewhere else because it's a fool's errand to even make ethanol out of corn.
Okay, so the issue, though, is, Den, that you know how President Trump is. If he makes a campaign promise, he's going to do everything that he can in order to see it through. So he made this promise to Iowans in the Iowa caucuses January of 2016. He says, if I'm elected president, I'm going to go forward with an ethanol plant to help out the farmers in Iowa. Now, before I get back to Brendan Williams, another caller, Brendan, text in so you can tackle these two comments.
Sure.
Colonel Mike in Virginia Beach texts in and says, biofuel, a.k.a. ethanol, rots fuel lines, wrecks engines. Some states don't allow ethanol at all. They don't allow the additives in gasoline, period. He goes on to say the amount of energy per gallon of gasoline is degraded. Therefore, engine performance is degraded. Just visit any auto parts store and research ethanol protective additives. So you got that text there, Mr. Williams, and you've also got what Den said. How do you respond to all that?
Sure, yeah. I think, both raise very real issues associated with mandating massive volumes of ethanol in the fuel supply. I think we'd always use some ethanol in the fuel supply. It has octane. When supplies are tight, it can act as a fuel supply extender. Even before we had an ethanol mandate, we did use some ethanol. But the problem is we're now mandating massive amounts, more than all engines and infrastructure can handle. And that's what, the call and the text highlight. There are some cars that can handle up to 10% ethanol. But as the caller mentioned, ethanol does have less energy content than a gallon of petroleum-based gasoline. And this is another one of the reasons why some environmental groups have even actually started criticizing the mandate. But you have a lot of engines out there, boats, lawnmowers, snow blowers, chainsaws, take your pick, right? Snowmobiles, that, the ethanol actually is, high concentrations of ethanol can be very corrosive to those types of engines. And that's why you see a lot of small engine groups, motorcycle groups, that are also opposed to the ethanol mandate. And I think, as I mentioned, we'd always use ethanol. We'd actually always use a decent amount of ethanol. But right now, you have this mandate that tries to keep driving more and more volumes, and is limiting the availability of ethanol-free gasoline for the folks who want to buy it. So it's limiting consumer choice. You throw this crazy credit program on top of it that's threatening refining jobs. And if something isn't addressed, you've got a real problem. I think, certainly the president can, support ethanol as a product. As I mentioned, I think we're always going to be using it. But he can do so in a way that not only addresses this crazy credit program to save manufacturing jobs, but also just prevents, unreasonable mandating of a fuel, continuously into the future. Because the more you do that, the more some of the problems that the caller highlighted and the text you received highlighted are going to materialize, and consumers aren't going to be happy. And I would argue it's not even in Iowa's interest to keep mandating this stuff, because if you do start getting more problems, people are going to have more of a backlash against ethanol as a product rather than the ethanol mandate.
Look, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a lot at stake here, no doubt, with the renewable fuel standards. And I want to thank Colonel Mike for texting in. I want to thank Den Black, who takes this from an engineering standpoint also. And I know that, ethanol's got some issues. But, again, trying to find the balance here between a promise the president made, and he's, as everyone knows, he's very committed to doing what he said he was going to do. And in the one time he did not with Afghanistan, it was heavily criticized for that by people like me, because that's what he ran on. So he's going to go forward with it. Hopefully, Brendan Williams, we can find a balance here, because
I think that's the key, John. I think that there is, the president wrote the art of the deal. I think he can find a win-win here. He can, find a way, to make sure that we have the largest biofuel industry in the world. The second largest biofuel producer is Brazil, and they make half of what we make. So I think there's plenty of opportunities where the president can still support a robust domestic ethanol industry, but also do so in a way that isn't threatening refining, manufacturing jobs, which he also promised, like in places like Pennsylvania, which he also promised to protect in the campaign. We're hopeful that, this meeting can result in a win-win.
All right, we're out of time. I want to thank Brendan Williams for being with us, Vice President, PBF Energy. We're going to be following the renewable fuel standards, and we're going to fight with you, Mr. Williams, to get it out of the swamp where the whole thing is right now. Boy, you come to this town, and as soon as the swamp gets a hold of it, it's bad for the consumer and bad for U.S. workers. I can tell you that. We're out of time. You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. Stay with us.